Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin in Berkeley, California. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in Houston, Texas, but ready to take a miraculous journey to New Mexico.
Yes, we're gonna dive into another one of our arts and culture features. We have started a new series on the Green and Red podcast where we're talking about art, culture, pop culture, film, television, music, books, whatever, what have you, that have raised political consciousness for us and many other people. And this is the second segment in the series. And today we're going to be talking about the Milagro Beanfield War, which was both a book and a film. We'll be talking mostly about the film. But to kick us off, Bob's going to talk about the book for a minute and the author.
Yeah, you're by John Nichols. And Nichols was a already established New York writer in Estero Cuckoo. And then he moved to the Taos area in New Mexico, where he immediately became involved in the local politics there. And the biggest issue were riparian rights, water, which is understandable, right? If you're a farmer, you need irrigation. And throughout the 20th century, as soon as more and more people, white people especially, moved into that, there's actually a story of settler colonialism. As more and more people moved into New Mexico, irrigation needs increased. And because of that, they had to develop like dams, build dams. They had a tax system and everything else. The tax burdens obviously grew. And a lot of the local people who were subsistence farmers could not pay their taxes. So many of them lost their land and didn't have access to the water because of that non-payment. And that had been going on throughout the entire 20th century. When Nichols moved to New Mexico in the 70s, he became an advocate for people like that and became involved in conservancy rights for farmers. And in the movie, one of the main characters who's portrayed as a lawyer actually is like Nichols' role in that. The only other thing I want to say is in terms of the movie, I think you're going to mention the cast and all that too, right? So, but there's a little bit about the producer before you do that. It was produced by Montezuma Esparza, who had been trying to get Hollywood to do this movie for a while, and they weren't really biting. So then he enlisted Robert Redford, and obviously Hollywood's not going to say no to Redford. But Montezuma Esparza set up a company called, I think, Maya Films, which did Latino, Hispanic-based movies, like Walkout, The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez, which is a great movie, Selena, The Disappearance of Garcia, Lord God, and others. So it fits within that framework. And I know anytime a lot of articles have been written about the Beanfield War from a Latin American perspective, Latin American culture, or its context within Latin American history. And so there's that element too, in addition to the water rights, which is clearly a class issue. And you'll talk about that, but it really is a multi-layered film, which was always one of my favorites, actually.
Yeah. And so just a couple of quick background facts on the film. Like Bob said, it was directed by Robert Redford, who was enlisted by Montezuma Esparza to be the director. Robert Redford had actually directed only one film before the Milagro Beanfield War, which was Ordinary People, which he won an Oscar for. And so he was a sort of hot item, even though this film came out 7 or 8 years after Ordinary People. The cast, it's an ensemble cast. I would describe it as that, which included some kind of bigger name stars, people who became bigger name stars later, and some of which were bigger name stars at the time, which included Christopher Walken, Melanie Griffith, Mexican American folk singer Ruben Blades, Sonia Braga, who was a Brazilian actress had been in Kiss of the Spider Woman, John Hurd, who is a favorite of the Green and Red podcast, who plays the Nichols character, the singer Freddie Fender. And so it's an interesting ensemble cast. If there's a main character, it's the character of the farmer and the handyman who actually starts the sort of the illegal irrigation of the bean field. The character's name was Joe Mondragon, but he is played by a lesser known actor named Chick Fanera, who sadly passed away in 2021. And then the other important thing to note about this film is that there's actually a cast of New Mexicans who actually play a bunch of different roles in the film as well. And it's a great film. It is set in Milagro, which means miracle. If you read the book, they describe the name of the valley where they all live as the Miracle Valley. But it's a small town in the American Southwest in New Mexico. In the film, there's a land developer whose family had been a sheep rancher and a powerful land baron named Lad Devine. Lad Devine is moving from ranching into developing a resort. And so Lad Devine is in the process of building a major new resort. And there's an activist in town named Ruby Archuleta, who's played by Sonia Braga. And then there's also a lawyer and newspaper editor who puts out like a biweekly newspaper named Charlie Bloom, who's the John Hurd character. They realize that this will result in the eventual displacement of local farmers, what Bob was describing, and it's the story that Nichols is wanting to tell. They can't arouse much opposition because of the short-term opportunities offered by construction jobs and things like that. But then when Joe Mondragon illegally diverts water to irrigate his bean field, the local people support him because of their resentment of water use laws that favor rich people like Lad Devine. And then it reaches the governor's office in New Mexico. Although they never say Santa Fe, they always call it the capital, even in the book. But when the governor sends in a ruthless troubleshooting cop named Carol Montana, played by Christopher Walken, to settle things quickly, the lucrative development is canceled. Small war threatens to erupt. And there's a number of other side stories. There's also an element we haven't talked about, which is there's an element of magical realism, which I think Bob will probably want to talk about more. And there's a magical character who speaks to another one of the characters that we're going to talk about. There's an ancient 100-year-old character, 100-year-old man named Amarante, who is like one of the sort of driving forces in the story. And he speaks with a magical character called the Coyote Angel, I believe. And so we'll talk about that some as well.
Like a Cocopelli.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I read this before I saw it, and I picked it up after I started reading Garcia Marquez, and I think Nichols probably was the American inheritor of that idea of magical realism. And there's a character in there named Braso Onofre, which is the arm of Onofre. This guy lost his arm, I think, in an accident of some sort. And so when something went wrong and they didn't want to take blame for it, they could blame Braso Onofre. So there's that. And Amarante communicates with the other world and things like that. So it's really a cool movie that way. It's very serious, but it's also very endearing and very charming in that regard.
Oh, go ahead.
No, that's cool.
And then there's a couple different themes. There's obviously this theme over conflict over water rights, but there's other themes that sort of emerge from the story. One is about the community power being more powerful than the individual. There's stories, or there's a story themes around home and place, the impending displacement of people who had lived there for hundreds of years, and then obviously a conflict between rich and poor. The storyline is a conflict over the sort of prime in real time sort of conflict is over land use and water rights. It's repeated again and again throughout the West and the Southwest in particular. And in this case, pits real estate developers against the impoverished locals. And then also there's a conflict of culture and how these cultures are the sort of Mexican, Latin, New Mexican cultures really connected to the land. And then we have wealthy people coming in and trying to develop it to build like golf courses and things like that.
Yeah, and country clubs. And then you have the outside liberals coming in, the Daniel Stern character, who's an anthropology student at NYU, doing his sociology, same thing. And Hurd, of course, who plays the Nichols type character, the New York lawyer who comes in. And he's, I think, a symbol of the 60s to get this sense that he probably was an activist lawyer, maybe defend like a William Kunstler type, and just got burnt out and headed to New Mexico thinking he could live an easier life there because he's reluctant to get involved in it as well when Ruby approaches him. I also think it's pretty cool that like women, especially Ruby Archuleta, play a major role in this kind of the activism of it as well. But yeah, just the intrigue between the locals and then these big guys. A lot of the reviews, because I read some of them last night, kind of said it was a bit simplistic, but I think for a movie, you can't get that sophisticated and that complicated. So I thought it was quite well done. And it does play these themes. I think that the main conflict for much of the movie is Christopher Walken plays I call him a bounty hunter. He's whatever. against, well, Joe. And in fact, Joe kind of escapes. I'm getting ahead of things, right? But this becomes a problem. And how does Amarante get shot? Remember? I forgot.
Amarante has a pet pig, and Joe goes to
Lupita, right?
Lapita, and
Yeah.
Joe comes and finds Lapita eating the beans in the bean field and starts shooting his gun to scare him away. And the pig charges him, and then he's running away and he shoots and he accidentally wounds Lapita. And then Amarante is enraged by this, who has his own gun, and starts shooting at Joe, and Joe accidentally shoots Amarante. And then Amarante goes to the hospital and almost dies, which leads to Joe becoming a fugitive and going into the mountains, being pursued by Montana, which is the Christopher Walken character. And
then he finds got an unwitting ally too.
And so there's another character in the film who's like the foreman of the Divine Ranch. His name is Horse Thief Shorty Wilson. He's played by James Gammon, who's a longtime sort of grizzled cowboy, good old boy actor in many films. He was actually in many Sam Shepard related productions, good friends with Sam Shepard. But Horse Thief Shorty saves Joe from Montana as Joe is pinned down, and then Horse Thief Shorty scares off Montana by firing on him, and then Joe is able to go back to the bean field and come out from being a fugitive, and the entire town joins Joe. This is the sort of like finale, and the entire town comes out with Joe and begins picking the beans, which then leads to the Montana bringing the state police to come after Joe, and there's a sort of standoff and showdown.
One of the things that always struck me too was he diverts basically a few trickles of water, and then he uses it to grow beans. And it shows just the type of power that those folks like Lad Divine want. He doesn't even want to share a little bit of water, some trickles of water with this guy. And I think that Shorty, Horse Thief Shorty, is a mouthful, right? Shorty also is interesting because he's the owner of the construction company, so he stands to make huge money off this. But you can see he also is pretty resentful of what they're doing to this area. I assume he's a local, and I think that's part of it too. A lot of these people grew up there and they see this happening. And New Mexico in the 70s and 80s, and even today, is on the very lower end in terms of states, right? In terms of their wealth, education system, healthcare, all that kind of stuff.
I think it's still in the bottom 5%.
It's pretty low. In the Vietnam era, I believe New Mexico actually had the highest rate in terms of percentage of young men wounded and killed in Vietnam. So it's a very poor state. And so you have this opulence, and of course the cultural part of it you can't ignore, right? You have this Latino culture, Joe and Ruby and everybody else. Who brought is Freddie Fender is the mayor. And then you have these kind of stereotypical white guys. You have Lad Divine, he's kind of older guy. He has a Melanie Griffith is his trophy wife. And so it plays on all this stuff. And it's clearly a white hat, black hat story. And it's not nuanced in that regard. The good guys and bad guys are from the start. And then the magical realism. But something that I always like, that I don't know if they do it in the movie or not, but in the book, do you remember what they call the police forces, various?
I haven't gotten that. So read the book. I haven't gotten that far into it.
They call the police the state pendejo factory. I think most of you probably know what pendejo is. In the pretty constant, the state pendejo factory, the guys at the state pendejo factory, right? So there's this real contempt.
There's an element of almost like guerrilla war. It starts off as petty larceny and crimes against the rich development company, but leads to guerrilla war. We find out later in the movie that Amarante is behind some of it, whether it's like stirring up the locals by taking a shot at Joe's house, or leaving crosses around town about how Milagro is going to be destroyed if the development project goes through, to many other things. And I think that's an important piece, because it harkens back to some of this culture of resistance in New Mexico, even before the New Mexicans, but it was the indigenous resistance against the Spanish and against the Americans and things like that. And I think that there's an element of that as well.
Yeah, because Amarante is 100, right? So that means you've been alive since the latter 19th century. You've seen all that, right? You've seen kind of the conquest of New Mexico, especially with white developers coming in. And
he was a sheriff, of Milagro in his early days too.
Yeah. And Taos and Santa Fe are huge tourist destinations now for Northeast wealthy people, especially. They're beautiful, right? But I've been there a few times, and every time I'm there, it's just full of people who love going to the galleries and dropping money and doing all that kind of stuff.
There's,
You know,
go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, and then you have some of the most dire poverty in America.
There's a great line in the where he goes into the bar with his Colt 45 and the bartender asks, and he starts loading the gun at the bar. They're all scared up because he's countering
He's so full,
man. And the bartender's, who do you think you are, Pancho Villa? Which is great.
Because that's where he was in southern New Mexico when they opposed that the U.S. Army was chasing him down.
Yeah, exactly. And he also has this other great line when Joe is starting, because he's very supportive of the Beanfield. He tells Joe nobody would do anything if they knew what they were in for. Yeah, and it's also a little bit of the line that kind of tells the whole story. It starts as a small little thing where he just kicks out one of the little mini dams that irrigate, and it leads to irrigating the Beanfield, and it leads to this whole thing. Yeah, this whole like war in the town.
When he does that, Ruby even says, "I knew Joe Mondragon would do one great thing in his life." You know?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's just this simple thing. Whether he's angry, he kicks a small sluice, and then the water trickles, and then the kind of light bulb goes on his head. And the townsfolk are telling him, "You can't do this. You're going to get in trouble." All that kind of stuff.
There's also one other piece I feel like the story is very structured about the different steps that the state and the company take to crack down or stop this whole symbolic sort of like struggle and opposition, which is at one point they actually try and buy off Joe and Ruby, and they offer Joe 3 months worth of work at $14 an hour, very short term, but still very lucrative for him to build like cabins related to the development. And then they also offer, Ruby runs the garage, but she also runs the plumbing service. And so they also offer her to install all the plumbing. And she refuses because it's very short term and it's still going to lead to the eventual end of Milagro. And in her line to say why she turns it down is like, what good is a hometown if everyone was gone? Which I think is also like an important line in the film as well.
Yeah. She's an important character, that kind of in many ways the strongest character, because Joe is tempted, to take this. And that really talks like corporations have that power, right? That co-optation strategy. Look at any union drive, which is similar to that, right? You always try to pinpoint a few people and give them priorities. And that's affirmative action, right? You give some people some benefits in order to divide everybody else. It just, like I said, reading the reviews, some of them, they were generally favorable, but a lot of them said it was simplistic and this and that, which is what a lot of people said about John Sayles' early movies too, especially, I think, May 1. And this fits within that category, right? It is similar to things like May 1 or Salt of the Earth, which kind of talk about these kind of interests in these areas, these kind of more rural areas, right? And of course, then this is really crucial because it's the Latino piece to it, which then at that point, especially in the 80s, they hadn't really done a lot of movies about Latino culture, had it?
No, not really. Not like big productions with people like Robert Redford attached to it.
Yeah. There was, what's the one with the blood? I forget. There was, it's from, Zoo Suit, right? I don't even know if that'd been a movie, it was play, right? But so it really was a breakthrough. I just remember when the movie came out, being pretty excited because there had been some talk about this as far as I had been trying to get it done for some time. I can't remember when Milagro came out. Milagro Beanfield War is part of a trilogy. Milagro Beanfield War, The Magic Journey, and Nirvana Blues. The other two are not, they're okay, but they're not like Milagro Beanfield War, which I think is just like a wonderful, charming, lovely book. It's a book and a movie that kind of at the end make you happy, but just it's a cool story, give you a chuckle and a warm feeling. Yeah, it's the equivalent of a lefty Latino Hallmark Christmas movie.
There's just a couple more things I want to say. I do want to say one little trivial fact about the film, which is Robert Redford directed it, and there's like a slight little inside joke or dig at his partner in crime, I guess you could say, which is Paul Newman. This is his partner in crime in the two films he made with him. Which is, there's a scene where they're in the store and there's Paul Newman salad dressing on the shelf, and the storekeeper's, "Oh no, don't buy that, but it's terrible." Or whatever the line is.
Yeah, that's no good. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And it's cool that Redford obviously stepped in and it did this and gave it cachet, and more importantly, was able to get funding. But it also says a lot, I think, about the Hollywood system that, nobody, and I remember at the time, apparently, as far as I had a fairly important role in this. Redford was the producer, but I get the sense Esparza was like a really important collaborator. They kind of really did work on this together. It's a great film. I used to have a custom at Thanksgiving. I would watch Milagro Beanfield War. I did that for several years. I introduced a bunch of people to it. It's not a hardcore, the kind of movies we often talk about, which are more overt. But, it's nice every now and then to win one, right? Because at the end, Joe really is a heroic figure.
Yeah. The last thing I want to mention, which I think is one of Bob's favorite lines in the film, which is about who is El Braso Onofre, which we described already, but I actually wrote down the quote. Do you want me to read it?
Sure.
All right. It's where Christopher Walken's character says, "Who is El Braso Onofre?" And then the sheriff, played by Ruben Blades, says, "That's Onofre Martinez's arm. He lost it in an accident some time ago, and nobody ever found it. People around here think it leads a life of its own." And then Shorty, something turns up missing in Milagro, and people feel like El Braso stole it. Young girls returning at home from their date without their underwear usually blame him. It just, the other part is a little bit of a comedy as well.
And
It deals with serious stuff, but
yeah. And if you read Garcia Marquez, this really does this fit in tightly. It's really cool that way. Yeah. Is it in the book? I think at one point, one of the theories about Braso and Onofre was that butterflies ate off and took his arm. Took his arm, which is very magical, really. And that's very much like the kind of stuff Garcia Marquez.
Right? He was laying in a field on a spring day.
Yeah, and the butterflies ate his arm. And it's just a really cool movie, but it has some great messages in it. As an activist and an organizer, you want to see depictions that give you some hope and some level of success. And it brings on these cultural issues, this clash of culture with these kind of, like I said, it's a story of Southern colonialism.
Right. Yeah.
Everybody loves to throw that word around, but that's really what we're talking about here. Or these kind of white people from the North, Northeast, wherever big cities come in, the big city people come in and they just wreak havoc on indigenous peoples there.
Just in thinking about it along the line, this movie came out in the late 80s and the book came out in the mid 70s. But as we have seen this sort of culture war erupt in the U.S., and we see a pretty big divide between, rural America and urban America. And we see that rural America shift to the right, partially over culture war. And we're also seeing a lot of Latinos support Republicans and Donald Trump, which seems pretty crazy in many ways. I think this is an important story for people who want to actually address that and crack that sort of culture war that the right has been winning. I think this is an important story to look at. It's 40 or 50 years old. The film came out something like 35 years ago. But I think it's still an important story when you want to examine the culture war of America and where we are in 2024.
Immigration is being presented as like a moral issue, right? These are bad people and they have drugs, they're bringing in drugs, they're committing crimes and all that. Immigration is about land and labor and this, clearly shows it. Also the time, around the time this is taking place, when Nichols went to New Mexico was the heyday of the La Raza Unida, these kind of Latino, Chicano organizations, which were started in the 60s and became very powerful in places like Colorado, Texas, then New Mexico. I knew a guy years ago.
California too.
California, who was involved in the La Raza Unida Rio Arriba County. And I believe Nichols did some stuff. Actually, the guy I knew actually crossed paths with Nichols a few times back in the early 70s in that area. And so this is underlying it too. This is a time, because we know so much about the African-American civil rights movement, as we should. And a fair amount of women's movement. We know about the Stonewall and the gay movements. But I think less,
American Indian movement, actually.
Less though about around the time this was happening was the time of A.S.T. Harina's attack on the courthouse in Trinity County Courthouse. Jorge Gonzalez in Colorado was doing stuff like that. You have kind of school walkouts of Hispanic students in places like Texas and California. And so there's a lot going on here. And this takes shape within that. It doesn't make reference to the other issues, although Charlie Bloom kind of does represent that kind of link to other issues. But it really is occurring at a time when Chicano political dissonance is really peaking. So it's cool in that regard too. But 35, 40 years later, obviously the developers win these eventually all the time, don't they? They get their way. But it's really cool to see in this movie that they fought back, these local people, and it was done in just such a cool way. And Gal Morante is a great character. And it's just a sweet but hopeful movie. It's a good, if you want to feel good at Thanksgiving or Christmas, it's a good holiday movie, I think.
I think that's a wrap on the Milagro Beanfield War.
Yeah.
Folks, you've been listening to the Arts and Culture of the Green and Red podcast, our Arts and Culture feature of the Green and Red podcast. We'll be having many of these. We also will take suggestions on themes and books and films and things like that to talk about. If you think it's something that's important and conscious raising, we're happy to look at it and talk about it. If you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit subscribe button. If you're listening to us on the many podcast platforms we're on, give us a rate and review. And then also, if you really like us, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit that support button and make a small donation, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And we'll talk to you again.
And remember, if you get in trouble at work, blame El Braso and Offer.
Yeah, here's to El Braso and Ofre. And so misbehave, make trouble, and resist day. And we'll talk to you again soon.